Media and games will often blend social sciences into them as a way to spice up worlds or magic systems. Want a place for monsters to come from? Well, how about our psychology? We can gamify Charles Jung's ideas around personas. It's not exactly a perfect retelling of his ideas, but modern psychology has kind of moved beyond his work anyway, and the general concept that we put on masks as we go through our lives is a pretty easy sell for a video game concept because, well, we do that. Saying that we do that and it actually makes monsters is just kind of adding icing to the cake. Political science is another common one. Games like Metaphor ReFantasio are obvious since they're based on fantasy elections, complete with public speaking and magic mind voting. Then there's games like Frostpunk that give you the role of a leader trying to keep your city alive in a world that wants to unexist your entire species. I mean, these hardly make fair comparisons to real politics, but they do okay with comparisons and allegory that might make people think a bit more about real-world events. Or at least make things more dramatic in a way we can understand. Criminology is also pretty common, though I admit the accuracy to real-world criminal sciences is pretty sparse compared to other fields. Criminals in video games are about as likely to be included with the hallway trash alongside goblins as they are to even have a fragment of personality. And you can get the other sciences that end up serving more as free buckets of ideas. Anthropology, history, economics, things that are part of scientific study but tend to be gamified to the point that there's really only a thread of connection to real-world sciences. But what if I told you that all of these overlap with a single scientific field? A sister field that doesn't get as much attention? Well, let's talk about sociology, whose gaming equivalent could only be the generalist class. Simply put, if you have at least two people, you can examine something with sociology. How people affect each other, how they interact. Maybe they're talking and one is commanding the other from on high. Maybe two people interact and one person's being judgmental of the other, even aggressively judgmental.
It's shameful what you've done to helpless beasts.
Well, then there's also crime. That's a pretty big field in sociology too. So what causes crime? Who tends to commit crime, and who tends to be prosecuted more? Who writes laws, and for whose benefit do the laws exist? Why do we classify certain actions as criminal or not? All of these questions are both sociological and criminological, so it's probably a little surprise that criminology and sociology are often the same department at a lot of universities. Sociology may be the indecisive child who jumps around a lot in conversations, but criminology is definitely one of their more common topics. But despite that, sociology doesn't tend to ask much about what is right or wrong. Questions like, oh, what is evil, or what is just? These are things sociologists like me don't usually care about discussing. Philosophers and others do enough of that as is anyway. But we will look at what people believe is good or evil, and why they believe that is. For instance, back in the 1980s, there was the Satanic Panic, where a bunch of parents were terrified that their children were being corrupted by Satan by playing Dungeons & Dragons. They believed that it was the devil's game, and was some incarnation of evil. Now, the idea that tabletop games are manifestly evil is pretty far out there for most people, but it was a thing back then. A few even viewed enjoying such a tabletop game as roughly the same as assault or murder. Now, sociologists might describe what happened through the analysis of social deviance or mores, but that's a topic for another day. Suffice to say for now, concepts like good and evil are in large part based on social norms, morals, and biases that we are taught as individuals. And no one is immune to being affected by whatever is taught to us. For instance, you, listener of this video, you certainly have your own set of morals, your own perceptions of right and wrong, your own way of looking at things. And you certainly learned a good chunk of those ideas and ideals from the culture that you grew up in. Even if you decided to rebel against the rules that you were taught, you're still being influenced by the culture that you're rebelling against. Being in a culture doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but it does mean that you are affected by it. Some things are common in cultures, but the details will always differ. But let's try a different angle. How does society affect us? Well, let's look at masculinity and femininity. At a fundamental level, they're just cultural concepts. How a man or woman is expected to act in the United States is different from Japan or Egypt. Heck, it can vary between areas within the United States. That's because things like gender expectations don't exist as singular, standalone facts. They're defined by a culture. For instance, if I say someone is a paragon of masculinity, some might think of a hulking man who is extremely good in a fight. Or you might think of something entirely separate, like some creative but tortured soul or a charismatic show host. This is because there are multiple kinds of masculinity and femininity that society has put together. We are taught to understand different norms, and what we are taught varies. It varies over time, it varies over place, and the details can vary by 1,000 different things. And for video games and media, these differences can influence our art. Let's say, for example, I want to write a feminine character. How do I show that? Speech patterns? Clothing choice? Style of physical prowess? Maybe she's more graceful? What counts as feminine anyway? The fact is, while we are commonly taught to generally act in masculine or feminine ways, people are also individuals, and details quickly become blurry when we try to pin down any specifics. So, to circle back around to my point, what is sociology? Well, at its most basic level, it is the study of social interaction. How people interact with each other, how we understand and think about others, how society can tell us what things like gender and race mean, and then treat us differently based on what traits we have. It can affect how we think about ourselves. We engage in groups like government, church, and family, and, well, that's because humans are social creatures, and we develop our sense of self and our sense of community through others. In other words, where biology looks at the body and psychology looks at the mind, sociology looks at the social. If people are involved, then so is social science. And last I checked, humans are pretty common. But video games and TV shows are often individual experiences, right? I hear some people ask. Well, they can be. But they are also made by artists and writers, who are typically people and drawing from their own experiences and knowledges when they create characters. And much like how you can't imagine a new color, you have to use a mishmash of things you know in order to come up with even the most wild of creative projects. And when we play games or watch TV, well, we have to interpret what we see and experience through the knowledge that we've gained from the cultures that we have already experienced. And since we're not all working with the same exact book of knowledge, that means that our interpretations can vary because our social experiences can vary. I mean, look at this guy. He's an 8-foot-tall monster of a man that's wearing a skull helmet. He works in a spaceship with flying cyborg babies. And they're telling me he's a chaplain. Last I checked, priests don't cosplay liches in power armor. Like, who do they even follow? Oh, their leader looks like that. Okay, maybe the skull face kinda makes some sense. But sidestepping that, is the character meant to be terrifying? Are they meant to be condescending? A source of guidance? Same game, but we could interpret them in different ways in the story. And if we wanted to dive in and examine something, we have a lot of points where we could choose to examine. For one, we could examine the creators of the story. What were their intentions in writing this character? How did the game developers seem to define faith, duty? What traits were they trying for this story to use, and what standards did they seem to be using themselves when writing the story? Or we could look at the individuals or game as existing within its own world by its own logic. How do these characters view war, religion? How do they treat the normal, non-8-foot-tall men and women of the universe? Or on a more meta level, we could also compare the game world to our own, or look at who the game is marketed to, or look at how the game is received by different populations. We have a lot of different ways to examine it. And I haven't even talked about multiplayer, or the fact that game culture and fan bases can kind of take on lives of their own. And since people are part of every part of this, we sociologists have a lot to chew on. Now, there are more common topics that we'll focus on: social inequality, gender, crime, etc., etc., etc. Traits and statuses that tend to affect everyone in some capacity, whether they like it or not. And when we look at things in the large scale, trends develop. People can share similar experiences. Now, exceptions do exist too. As I tell my students, personal mileage will vary whenever applying sociology to your own life. but it can still be a great tool to consider how broader parts of society affect us as individuals. We can compare stories, examine experiences, and piece together why people act the way that they do, why society is structured the way that it is. That is sociology. We look at people, at norms at a societal level, at anything that involves humans, and we try to find out how it works. So, no surprise that sociology can sometimes be a bit of an ivory tower science. Our field can easily seem like a complicated mess, which is not wrong, and we're generally pretty bad at explaining what we do in simple terms. But I want to try and work on some of that with this channel. Society is stupid big and stupid complicated, but using games and art can make things like that more manageable. And for me, I just love video games, and I can't help but notice these trends in what I experience. So I guess I want people to suffer through what I have to go through whenever I play. Either way, I hope you'll join me on this trip of slapping some more science into gaming and popular media. You know the buttons to hit if you like the idea. I hope you all have a good one.